In this video, we are going to learn about respiratory physiology. We are going to cover pulmonary ventilation mechanics. In this video, pulmonary ventilation in normal language is known as breathing. To learn about breathing, we have to know about the atmospheric pressure because our respiratory pressures, they are described relative to the atmospheric pressure. So atmosphere around us, the air around us, it has a pressure and it is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. So we say that 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level is equal to 1 atmosphere. This is how we write atmospheric pressure. So PATM is equal to 1. It means what I'm actually saying, that the absolute atmospheric pressure at this time is 760 millimeters of mercury. And respiratory pressures, they are described relative to the atmospheric pressure. For example, a negative respiratory pressure, it is less than the atmospheric pressure. For example, if there is an atmosphere, I say that the respiratory pressure is -4. It means it is 760 minus 4, which is equal to 756 millimeters of mercury. But when we talk about respiration, we describe it as like -4 respiratory pressure, whatever the name of the respiratory pressure is. And then positive respiratory pressure, it is greater than the atmospheric pressure. And zero respiratory pressure means it is equal to the atmospheric pressure. Now let's see what are the respiratory pressures. So there is intra-alveolar pressure. This is the pressure which is present in the alveoli. We know that alveoli, they are the air sacs where the air comes in, and in those alveoli there is a pressure which is known as intra-alveolar pressure, and the value of that pressure is 0 millimeter Hg. 0 millimeter intra-alveolar pressure means that it is equal to the atmospheric pressure. So at zero, this intra-alveolar pressure is also known as intrapulmonary pressure because this is the pressure which is present inside the lung, and this is how we write it. And over here it means that the intrapulmonary or the intra-alveolar pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure. And this is how we write this. So 0 intra-alveolar or 0 intrapulmonary pressure means that this is equal to the atmospheric pressure. And then we have another term, let me make a better A. Then we have another pressure which is known as the intrapleural pressure. Intrapleural pressure is present in the pleural cavity. We know our lungs, they are lined by a pleura, and this pleura has two layers. The visceral layer is tightly bound to the outer surface of the lungs, and then it's another layer which is known as the parietal layer. It is tightly bound to the rib cage, and between these two layers there is a space which is known as pleural cavity. This pleural cavity, it has a negative -4 pressure, and it is very important because this negative pressure, it is responsible for keeping the lungs inflated. This negative pressure, it pulls the lungs outward. And because there we know there is a small amount of pleural fluid present in the pleural cavity, because of that because of the suction power of that pleural fluid, the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, they are stuck together. Just like if you put a drop of water between two glass slides, they can slide on each other, but they are stuck together, they don't get separate. Similarly, this small amount of parietal fluid in the pleural space, it keeps the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura stuck together. And then, as I told you before, that this parietal pleura, it is tightly attached to the rib cage. So it pulls this visceral pleura towards the rib cage, and that is how this negative pressure is maintained. And this negative pressure, it keeps the lung inflated, it keeps the lung open. So this is right now, I'll come back to this point again. Let me right now tell you that what this negative pressure means. That negative pressure means that This is -4. It means that it is -4 points lower than the atmospheric pressure. So if atmospheric pressure is 760, 760 minus 4 is equal to 756 millimeters of mercury. So this is our intrapleural pressure. Then we have a third type of pressure, which is known as transpulmonary pressure. So if I subtract intrapleural pressure from the intra-alveolar pressure, I get transpulmonary pressure. So this is basically, if I write down here, it is intrapulmonary pressure, which is also known as the intra-alveolar pressure. When I'm sorry about my writing, when I subtract this intrapleural pressure, it is written as a big P and then IP for intrapleural, and here small ip. So when I subtract intrapleural pressure from the intraalveolar pressure, I get transpulmonary pressure. So we are subtracting 756 from the 760, and we get 4 millimeters of mercury. This is the transpulmonary pressure. Now let me come back to the point where I was talking about how this negative pressure is maintained. So just look at this. This is our chest cavity and our lungs. And the chest cavity. The chest cavity, it has a natural tendency to expand, to move outwards. So the elasticity of the chest cavity is that it wants to go this way. That I'm talking about the rib cage. So the rib cage, it wants to go this way, right? So the force it is exerting on the lungs is that it wants to pull them towards out. And why is this rib cage pulling on the lungs? Because the rib cage, it is lined by the parietal pleura, and that parietal pleura, it is stuck to the visceral pleura because of the suction pressure of the tiny amount of parietal fluid present here. So, and that visceral pleura is then stuck to the lung. So when the rib cage, it pulls on the parietal pleura, it also pulls on the visceral pleura, and visceral pleura, it pulls on the lungs. So this rib cage, it wants to pull this system outside. This is what its natural elasticity is of the rib cage. Now there are other two forces which are acting on the lungs, and those forces, they want the lungs to collapse, to move inside. What are those two forces? Number one, we have there is a natural tendency of the lungs to recoil because it has elastic fiber in it, and that elastic fiber, it wants it to become smaller and recoil. So the natural recoil of the lung, it is to move inwards. If I write here, so the lungs, their natural recoil wants them to move inside. So they have a recoil because elastic recoil, and it wants them to move inside. I think I will not write it. Here I'm not very good at writing. So, but the lung, there are two forces acting on the lung, and they want the lung to move inside. And the other, it is the surface tension, which is because of the fluid which is lining the alveoli. So these two forces, they balance each other. The inward pull of the lung due to the elasticity and the and the surface tension, they want to pull the lung inside, and then the rib cage, because its recoil is on the outside, it wants to pull it to the outside. And then we have these pleura which are like stuck to each other. So these forces balance each other, and the intrapleural pressure is kept negative. It is, and the lungs are kept inflated, and it is very important that this intrapleural pressure stays negative, otherwise the lungs will collapse. So this is basically a revision of what we discussed. So the respiratory pressures, we have intrapulmonary pressure, It is also known as intra-alveolar pressure. This is how we write it. It is the pressure in the alveoli which rises and falls during respiration. So it rises and falls during respiration. It falls with inspiration. It rises with expiration. But it always equalizes with the atmospheric pressure. So when it falls during inspiration, what is its now what does it want? It want to be in equilibrium with the atmospheric pressure, so it wants to move towards zero. And similarly, when in expiration it becomes more positive than the atmospheric pressure, it again wants to maintain an equilibrium with the atmospheric pressure, and that helps to move the air in and out, and we will go over it again. So the first pressure is the intrapulmonary pressure. It is also the intra-alveolar pressure. Then we have intrapleural pressure. This is how it is written, and it is always negative, and usually it is 4 millimeters of mercury less than the intrapulmonary pressure. And the negative intrapleural pressure is due to opposition of two forces. Like I said, the recoil force due to elasticity and surface tension of the alveolar fluid in the lungs, which wants to pull the lungs inward, and the natural tendency of the chest wall to pull outward. So these two forces, they balance each other, but not totally. There is negative intrapleural pressure in the pleural cavity. And then we have a third pressure which is known as transpulmonary pressure, and we get this transpulmonary pressure by subtracting intrapleural pressure from the intrapulmonary pressure. It is the difference between the intrapulmonary and the intrapleural pressure. The greater the transpulmonary pressure, the larger is the volume of the lung, and it keeps the lungs from collapsing. So let's learn a few more points about the intrapleural pressure. So intrapleural pressure, it is always a negative pressure, because if it becomes positive, the lungs are going to collapse. So it means it is lesser than the atmospheric pressure, and it is lesser than the intrapulmonary pressure, and usually it is 4 millimeter less than the intrapulmonary pressure. And then we know that in the pleural space, it is a pressure in the pleural space. In the pleural space we have a fluid, right? And that fluid level must be kept minimum. And how do we keep it minimum? Excess fluid is pumped out by the lymphatic system. If the fluid accumulates, this intrapleural pressure will become positive, and the lung will collapse. And then we already went over these two forces which are trying to uh, one force is trying to collapse the lungs, that is the lung recoil, and then there is thoracic recoil. And these two forces, they balance each other in such a way that the intrapleural pressure, it remains negative. Okay, so this is all. I already went over these points, so let's move on to the next slide. So what can go wrong if our pleural membrane which is encircling the lung, which has a visceral pleura part and the parietal pleura part, it gets damaged, and the atmospheric air, it enters the pleural cavity. So it can happen in two ways. One is that the pleura, they can get punctured. So when they get punctured, the atmospheric air, it enters the pleural cavity. Now the pressure in the pleural cavity and the atmosphere is the same there, right? So there is no negative pressure in the pleural cavity, which will keep the lungs inflated. So as a result, the lung, it recoils, and and the air, it fills the pleural cavity. We call this condition pneumothorax. Pneumo means air, thorax means in the thorax, so air in the thorax. The other way in which this can happen, that is if the visceral layer of the pleura, it gets damaged again, and the result will be the same. Other condition in which the lungs collapse, it is known as atelectasis, and it is due to the plugged bronchioles which cause collapse of the alveoli. We already went over pneumothorax. Now let's start the important topic, breathing. Breathing is known as pulmonary ventilation because when we breathe, we ventilate our body, right? We take the oxygen in and we get the carbon dioxide and we are ventilating our body. So pulmonary ventilation is a mechanical process causing gas flow into and out of the lungs according to the volume changes in the thoracic cavity. So, and then when these volume changes happen, they lead to pressure changes. Pressure changes lead to the flow of gases to equalize pressure. So we will go over this. So what happens? That there, first of all, there is a volume change in the capacity of the lungs, and because of that volume change, there is a pressure change in the gases. And because of that pressure change, that pressure gradient, the air, it either moves into the body or it moves out of the body. And it consists of the breathing. It has two phases, inspiration and expiration. Now let's see what the volume change means and how it happens, and what the pressure change means and how and why it happens. This brings us to a law known as the Boyle's law. The Boyle's law, it states the pressure of a gas increases as its volume decreases, assuming constant mass and constant temperature. So pressure is inversely proportional to the volume. So just consider these two beakers. These are two beakers. Both of these orange things, these are gas molecules. So as you can see, this the volume in this beaker for this gas molecule is more compared to this. So at this volume, considering the mass of the gas, the amount of the gas molecules and the temperature is the same. At this volume, these gas molecules, this gas has a certain pressure, right? And when the volume is decreased, now the pressure has increased. As you can see, when we have moved this lid down, the pressure has increased, although the volume has decreased. So pressure, it is inversely proportional to the volume. Now just imagine if there was a connection between these two beakers. If there is a connection between these two beakers, I will remove it. Let me not cover the written part. Let me just make it like this. Just imagine if these two beakers are connected, right? There is a pipe going from between these two and connecting these two. Where do you think the movement will be? Will be from this system to this system or from this system to this system? Well, I think the movement is going to be when pressure is applied here. When we move the lid down, the pressure over here increases and the gas is going to move from this side to this side. So this brings us to this point, that the gases, they flow from the higher pressure to the lower pressure, right? So over here there are more molecules of gas, so they are going to move, and it means there's more pressure, so they're going to move to the lower pressure. Similarly in this system, if they had a choice, they will move to this system when the pressure increases. And then there are some basic things about the gases. Gases, they always fill the container they are in, right? They spread out. If I increase the volume more, this will be more, the pressure will go low and the volume will be increased. And then if the amount of gas is the same and container size is reduced, the pressure will increase. And then these pressure changes, they lead to the gas flow. And this is the formula for the Boyle's law. And P1V1 is equal to P2V2. Now let's see how in our body, how this helps in the movement of the air inside the body, which is known as inspiration. Inspiration, when we inhale, when the air goes inside the body, and expiration is when we exhale and when we take the air out of the body into the atmosphere. So what happens? We said that pressure changes, they lead to gas flow. Now let's see what is the atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeter Hg. Now our during inspiration, the intrapulmonary pressure, which is usually when the person is not inspiring or expiring, this intrapulmonary pressure, it is equal to 0. So this like we discussed in the beginning, that the intrapulmonary pressure or the intraalveolar pressure, this is equal to 0. And when I say 0, I mean it is equal to the atmospheric pressure. It means that no net movement of air is happening inside or outside at this value. But when it happens that there is a muscle which is known as diaphragm, this muscle, it moves down. When it moves down, and also there are other muscles which are present over here between the ribs, they are known as external intercostal muscles. When this muscle moves down and these muscles, they pull the rib cage out, the lungs, they expand because there is more volume inside the thorax, and as a result the lungs expand. When they expand, uh, the uh, the pressure, it decreases from 0 to -1. This is 0, I'm sorry, a very irregular 0. So the pressure, the pulmonary pressure, it decreases from 0 to -1. So now we have a pressure gradient. What does -1 means? It means that now the pulmonary pressure is 759. So this pressure gradient, it is enough to cause the movement of the gas. So gas moves from the higher pressure to the lower pressure, so it moves here. So, and we inspire the air, it goes in. And then what happens when this muscle, this diaphragm, it relaxes, it comes back up, and the lungs are pushed up, and the volume in the lung is decreased. And when the volume in the lung is decreased, we know that pressure is inversely proportional to the volume according to the Boyle's law. So when the volume is decreased, the pressure is increased. So now we have intrapulmonary pressure of +1, and the gas, it is going to move from higher pressure to the lower pressure. So this is what means that now the intrapulmonary pressure, it is 761, whereas the atmospheric pressure, it is 760. So the air moves out of the body. I hope I have been able to explain this to you. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we will talk about the muscles of inspiration. So we already learned that what happens in the inspiration. In the inspiration, the air, it moves into the lungs, it moves into the body. Inspiration, it is an active process. Active process, it means that inspiratory muscles are involved, and then we spend energy to inspire. And what are the muscles of inspiration? They are diaphragm and the external intercostal. So under normal healthy conditions, these two muscles, they are responsible for inspiration. And diaphragm, it is this muscle which is represented by this purple line over here. This is a dome shaped muscle. It is extending into the thoracic cavity, and when it contracts, it becomes kind of like straightened over here. So this increases the volume over here, and the lungs, they're also pulled down, and the volume in the lungs increases. And as we discussed in the previous slide, when the volume increases, the pressure in the lung is going to decrease. So this is the one of the inspiratory muscle is diaphragm, and the other inspiratory muscle is the external intercostal muscles. These muscles are present between the ribs, and when they contract, they lift the rib cage out. So when they lift the rib cage out, again they are increasing the volume for the lungs. The lungs are pulled along with the rib cage. Remember our visceral and parietal pleura, they are providing a force, and the lungs are now more inflated, and this also increases the volume inside the lung, and when the volume increases, the pressure goes down. So both of these muscles, when they act, the result is an increase in the thoracic volume. So we just discussed the muscles that normally help us breathe in, that normally help us inspire. Like right now, me and you, we are sitting. So the muscles which are acting right now and which are helping us to inspire are the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. But when there is forced deep inspiration, which can occur during vigorous exercise. Remember, when you exercise, you really run out of breath, and then you're taking deep breaths. And also in people who have a disease, COPD, it is an obstructive disease. In these conditions, the accessory muscles are also used for inspiration. And these are the accessory muscles for inspiration. They are scalenus, sternomastoid, and the pectoralis minor. Then sometimes erector spinae muscles of the back, they also help. And these muscles, they act to further increase the thoracic cage size, creating a larger pressure gradient, so more air is drawn in. So this is when there is forced inspiration, which happens in case of exercise or in people who have a disease, who have a lung disease. Now let's see, let's go over the other part of our breathing or pulmonary ventilation, which is expiration. So I have inspired air in my lungs. And how did I do it? My diaphragm contracted and my external intercostal muscles, they contracted, and the volume of my lung increased. And when the volume increased, the pressure it decreased. It means it became subatmospheric pressure and the air was drawn in. And now how am I going to expire? Expiration is a passive process. Okay, so a passive process means that no energy is being spent in it. What is going to happen? My diaphragm and my external intercostal muscles, they are going to relax. Right, when my diaphragm relaxes, it again becomes the dome shaped. Remember, when I inspired, it became a flattened line and the thoracic cavity, it increased. But now it has again become dome shaped and it is pushing on my lungs, and my lungs have gone back. And similarly, the intercostal muscles, the external intercostal muscles have also relaxed and the rib cage has come down. So now the volume in the lung has decreased. As a result, the pressure has increased. And now because of that increased pressure, to reach to an equilibrium with the atmospheric pressure, the air is moving out. So the important thing to remember is that expiration under normal conditions, when I do not have any disease in my lungs, expiration is a passive process. Simply the inspiratory muscles, they relax and the thoracic cavity volume, it decreases, and the lungs recoil, volume decreases, and which causes an increase in the pressure. The pressure becomes +1, and +1 is, it means it is more than the atmospheric pressure. +1 means it is 761. So this pressure gradient, it causes the air to flow out, and this is how the expiration happens. And now what happens in forced expiration? Forced expiration can happen in certain conditions, especially if someone has some disease in the lungs. The lungs are not healthy. So then forced expiration, it is an active process and it uses oblique muscles and the transverse abdominal muscles as well as the internal intercostal muscles. So these three sets of muscles are used for the forced expiration. So I said that pulmonary ventilation, which in normal term we call breathing, it has two phases: inspiration, when the air goes in the lung, and expiration, when the air comes out of the lungs. And now there are also some other air movements which are known as non-respiratory air movements. So these movements, they are not helping me breathe, but these also happen, and most of them are a result of a reflex action. Also some are also voluntary. And what are the examples? Coughing, sneezing, crying, laughing. So during these actions also there is some movement of air in and out of the lungs, but they are not helping us breathe. Now let's go over the events as they happen in the inspiration. Then we will go over the events as they happen in the expiration. So the first step is that the inspiratory muscles, they contract. And what are the inspiratory muscles? The diaphragm and the external intercostal. We are talking in a healthy lung, at a normal person who is sitting just like I am sitting right now and you are sitting. So the inspiratory muscles, they contract, and when they contract, the diaphragm, it moves down, and these external intercostal muscles, they pull the rib cage out. So when the diaphragm moves down and the rib cage it is pulled out, the thoracic cavity volume it increases. And this is how they have shown it over here. So this sternum is pulled outside, the ribs are moved also moved outside to the sides because of the external intercostal muscle. So this diameter increases, and also this diameter has increased because of the diaphragm. Now, because the thoracic cavity volume has increased, the lungs, they are stretched, and intrapulmonary volumes, they increase. When intrapulmonary volumes increase, the pressure decreases because according to the Boyle's law, I will write it down here again. According to the Boyle's law, pressure is inversely proportional to the volume. So when the volume has increased, the pressure has decreased. And we know that the pulmonary pressure, which is written intrapulmonary pressure, which is written like this, P pulmonary, or it is also known as the intra-alveolar pressure. It is equal to 0 when a person is not breathing. So from 0 it has decreased to -1. So -1 means that it is -1 less than the atmospheric pressure. So now we have an intrapulmonary or intrapleural pressure of -1, which is less than the atmospheric pressure, and the air it is moving in because of the pressure gradient. And the air it keeps on moving into the lungs till the pressure, the intrapulmonary pressure, it becomes 0 because all the systems they want to reach an equilibrium. We are done with the inspiration. Now let's see what happens during expiration. Remember, expiration it is a passive process. So now what happens in the expiration, that the muscles of inspiration they relax. So this diaphragm it again becomes a dome shaped, which reduces the thoracic cavity volume, and then the external intercostal they also relax, and this brings the rib cage back to its normal level. Because of this, the thoracic cavity volume it decreases. Now the lungs they recoil, and because of the recoiling of the lung, the intrapulmonary volume it decreases. And when volume decreases, the pressure it increases in the lungs. So now the pressure it is +1 millimeters of mercury. It means it is +1 more than the atmospheric pressure. So if the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, at this time the intrapulmonary pressure is 761 millimeters of mercury. But this is usually how we express it. We say the intrapulmonary pressure is now +1. And because of that increased intrapulmonary pressure, there is a pressure gradient, and now the air it flows out of the lungs into the atmosphere till an equilibrium of 0 is reached. So this is our inspiration and expiration. So we can see in graphic form how the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure how they appear. So this is atmospheric pressure on this side, and if you see atmospheric pressure 0, it means this is the intrapulmonary pressure, and during inspiration it goes down to -1. So this is between 0 and -2, and then it reaches the equilibrium again, and during expiration the muscles they relax and the pressure it goes to +1, and then it reaches an equilibrium. So this is expiration, right? And then in the intrapleural pressure, so the intrapleural pressure it also changes with breathing, and it always stays negative. This is important. So during inspiration the intrapleural pressure from -4 it goes to -6, and then during expiration it comes back to -4. So this is intrapleural pressure, and then the difference between intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure, this is known as the transpulmonary pressure. And then let's see what is happening to the volume of the volume of breath. So if we are starting at 0, so the volume of the breath is increasing because air is coming in, and then the volume of the breath it is decreasing because the air is going out. Okay, now let's see what are the factors which influence pulmonary ventilation or breathing. There are three factors which can influence. They are airway resistance, alveolar surface tension, and lung compliance. Let's go over them one by one. The first factor is the airway resistance. What is airway resistance? Airway resistance is the friction encountered by air in the airways, and this is how we calculate the gas flow of everything. This is the formula. We also went over this formula when we were doing cardiovascular system. So flow over here, it is airflow or gas flow is equal to the pressure gradient divided by the resistance. So it is inversely proportional to the resistance. If the resistance is big, the flow will be less. But in airways, the resistance, it is insignificant because of two reasons. So I want you to remind you another formula we did in the cardiovascular system, which is resistance is inversely proportional to the radius of the vessel, or in this case the radius of the airway. So now in the upper airways, they are very large. The trachea and the main bronchi and then the bronchi, they are very large. So because of that, the resistance, it becomes insignificant, significant because their radius is quite large. And then the lower airways, although they are smaller and they have small radius, but they are too many of these. They are in millions. So the total cross-sectional area is large, and again the resistance, it cannot affect as much. So the resistance, it is important in the medium-sized bronchi only. Also in the terminal bronchi, diffusion is the main force, right? In this, the flow of the air is not the main force. The main force is the diffusion. So again, a resistance cannot play a role here. We can see over here what we discussed in the previous slide. So this is resistance and this is the airway. So this will be a bigger airway and it is turning into smaller airway. Over here is are the terminal bronchioles. So in the large airways, the resistance is over here, and then it is somewhat significant in the conducting zone in the medium sized bronchi. Then after medium sized bronchi, it is greatly reduced because there is too much surface area. Total surface area is lot. And then in the terminal bronchioles, we enter the respiratory zone. Now diffusion has taken over the flow of the gas. So sometimes when under special conditions, the resistance becomes important. When does that happen? If someone inhales some irritants, those irritants, they can activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system causes bronchoconstriction. It is going to constrict the bronchi and the bronchioles, and the resistance will increase. And then in acute asthma, the histamine, it also causes bronchoconstriction. And where then we know that the sympathetic nervous system, it causes bronchodilation. We went over it when we were doing fight and flight response. That sympathetic nervous system, it dilates the bronchioles, and also epinephrine is used as a drug in different situations when we need bronchodilation. And then a local accumulation of mucus or infection material or some solid tumors, when they block the passageway, they also increase resistance because now the passageway is blocked. And airway resistance, when it rises, the bronchioles, they become constricted or obstructed, and now the breathing movements, they become strenuous. Now it becomes they take more energy. The breathing takes more energy now. The second factor which influences the pulmonary ventilation, it is alveolar surface tension. So we know our alveoli, they are lined by a watery fluid, and water, it has a surface tension. It tends to get together, and because of that force, it tries to collapse the alveolus. And what is the solution? Our body has surfactant which is produced by type 2 alveolar cells, and this surfactant, it lines the alveolus and it reduces the surface tension. So what happens if we do not have surfactant? In premature babies, there is a syndrome which is known as infant respiratory distress syndrome, because surfactant, it is on the full term babies, they can make surfactant. Babies who are born premature, they do not make surfactant. As a result, their alveoli, they are collapsed, and collapsed alveoli, they require greater energy to inflate. So these children, they are at risk and they develop this syndrome. And the treatment is that they're sprayed with the sympathetic or the natural surfactant, and then also positive pressure devices are used. But all these things, they also have side effects which can affect the baby for the rest of their. So we are discussing the factors which influence the pulmonary ventilation. We already went over resistance and then the surface tension. And now the third thing is the lung compliance. Lung compliance, it is the measure of change in the lung volume that occurs with given change in transpulmonary pressure. It means how much the lung can stretch, in simple words. And it depends upon the distensibility of the lung, and it also depends upon the surfactant. If the surfactant is present, it reduces the surface tension and distensibility of the lung. If it is a healthy lung, it will be able to stretch. And higher lung compliance means that it is easier to expand the lung. This is the formula by which we can calculate the lung compliance. CL is the lung compliance. Delta V, this is, it equals the changes in the lung volume, and then this delta, we know this is intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure, so it is the difference between the two pressures. And compliance, it is diminished by non-elastic scar tissue replacing the lung tissue. For example, if there is some inflammation or there is some injury in the lung, and when that lung heals, there is scar tissue. So now instead of the elastic tissue, there is scar tissue, and that scar tissue is not going to stretch as much as the elastic tissue stretches. And then maybe there is, due to some reason, there is reduced production of the surfactant. Now this is going to increase the surface tension, and the compliance will decrease. And then the other reason can be that the lung is okay, but there is some problem with the thoracic cage. So if the thoracic cage is not, it cannot lift up, even then the lung compliance, it will decrease.